Hello Africa, a very good evening and a warm welcome to yet another informative episode of Bottomline Africa. My name is Yusuf Ibrahim. It is Wednesday, the 21st day of February 2018, and definitely we have a lot lined up for you in the program. We have the very latest from Kenya, Uganda as well as South Africa. I'm going to give you those stories shortly, but first let me take you straight to our highlights tonight. Kenya now warns its citizens about traveling to South Sudan, even after 2 Kenyan hostages held by rebels settled back home. UN Refugee Agency UNHCR raised an alarm of an alleged scam by senior government officials to defraud the agency. Friends, relatives and fans of legendary Burkina Faso filmmaker Idrissa Ouedraogo celebrate the life of one of Africa's finest creatives. United Nations Volunteers Chief speaks exclusively to KTN News about his mission to East Africa. Good evening once again. The program begins right now, and before our top story, let me pose this question for you on our Twitter poll tonight. We are asking you, do you support the travel advisory by Kenya against South Sudan? Do you support the travel advisory issued by Kenya against the youngest nation in Africa, that is South Sudan? You know the drill. Our Twitter handle is at KTN News. You can as well tweet me at Yusuf Ibra. The hashtag to use is Bottomline Africa. As you do that, let me begin with our top story tonight. And the Kenyan government has issued a warning to her citizens wishing to travel to parts of South Sudan. Now, an advisory from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said all Kenyan nationals leaving or traveling to South Sudan should move away from and avoid traveling to areas where armed conflicts and inter-ethnic violence have occurred within the last 6 months. Now, this travel advisory applies specifically to parts of the Greater Upper Nile region, and in particular, these regions, which I might not pronounce it correctly, they include Bie, Latjor, Akobo, Jonglei, Northern Lich States and parts of Maiwut, Eastern Nile and Boma States and Yei River State. Now, the warning came just a day after 2 Kenyan pilots detained by rebel forces in Akobo were released, ending a 5-week ordeal. Kenyan nationals in other parts of the country have also been advised to avoid unnecessary travels and exercise extreme caution as they undertake their daily activities. Over to Uganda now. And the United Nations Refugee Agency said on Tuesday its donors had told them they will withhold funding for Ugandan operations until refugee numbers were verified after relief theft accusations in the East African country. Now, multiple investigations are underway by both the Ugandan government and the United Nations and the European Union to try to verify claims that officials inflated refugee numbers in Uganda to steal aid. Now, accusations have also included large-scale sale of food and other relief items for refugees, bribery and trafficking of refugee girls. Teresa Ngalo, a UNHCR spokeswoman, told a news conference in the Ugandan capital Kampala there were questions about the number of refugees in Uganda. Last week, the Ugandan government, which was already investigating possible culpability by its own officials, said it was widening the probe to include UNHCR and the UN's World Food Programme.
Unsubstantiated reports in various media have threatened to tarnish the reputation of Uganda, which is currently Africa's largest refugee hosting state and has one of the most progressive policies worldwide for people fleeing conflict and persecution. UNHCR wishes to state that fraud, corruption, sexual exploitation and abuse, and sexual harassment are considered misconduct. UNHCR's priority is to protect refugees and to ensure that the resources provided by governments and donors are responsibly managed with full accountability. What we have had is donors indicate to us that they need assurances that these matters are being dealt with, hence the verification exercise, and that if they don't receive those assurances, they may withhold funding.
Now, most East African community projects stall due to inconsistency by member countries in giving their contributions. This is what has so far emerged even as Fourth Parliament of Yala continue with their orientation trip, which has involved inspection of institutions in member countries. Our reporter Cecilia Kesho, who has been on the trip, reports from Entebbe, Uganda.
This being the second week of the Yala Members of Parliament orientation trip that began in Mombasa last week through Moshi, Arusha in Tanzania and back to Nairobi through Namanga to Uganda, Kampala. Several issues have had to crop up, and especially in the institutions that have been established in the member countries by the East African community. For example, in the morning we were at the East African Development Bank before heading to the Inter-Universities Council for East Africa, where a number of issues came up. And one of the issues, for example, was staffing, that they have little staff. They're not able to employ enough staff to run their errands. And this, they said, is because some of the countries do not contribute or do not give their contributions as per the agreement of the treaty of this community. So let's hear what the members of parliament had to say about this.
We have so many degrees given out, doctors, engineers, who will go out and masquerade that they have the degrees and fill positions. How do we evade? How do we minimize? Why don't you think of a center where checking the entire graduates?
One of the things that we'd like to do is to organize meetings in each of the partner states in a rotational way. But sometimes, especially in meetings that require quorum, we are unable to hold in one partner state because apparently some of the members from one partner state might not come. So I'll just leave it there.
Here in Entebbe, Uganda, we are at the Civil Aviation Safety and Security Agency, which is an East African agency again, or rather East African institution that deals with matters concerning airlines. So again, the issue of staffing, poor staffing coming up, that they do not have enough funds, that the member states do not fulfill their pledges, their contributions sometimes do not come through. So this is an issue that, again, members of parliament wade into, and perhaps telling each Yala member to go back into their country and sit down with their leadership and discuss this matter in detail.
Every time, every quarter, you need to remind us through the committees of Yala that your partner states, you the members of parliament who come from those partner states, remind the councils of ministers to inform the ministers of finance to remit their obligations.
As of now, we are having to have some member states' contribution as receivables on the book, on our books. We treat them as receivables, but which are not being realized.
So if we take those kinds of excuses and we lay back and accept that the planes coming to Africa are of inferior quality than those that are going to Europe or America, whatever, we are doomed. This is the usual practice.
Remember, these are issues that will come into a report that will go to Rwanda. Even as we head to end the trip towards the end of the week, members will look into the report and adopt it before going to discuss it and legislate when they go back to their sittings in Arusha, Tanzania. From here in Entebbe, Uganda, my name is Cecilia Kesho. Back to studio.
Now, down south and South Africa was bracing for a tough budget speech today amid renewed optimism spurred by the country's new reformist president, who has promised to drive the economy out of the doldrums. Cyril Ramaphosa took over last week from the scandal-plagued Jacob Zuma, raising hope for a turnaround in the economy there that slid into recession in 2016 and has grown only tepidly since. Now, Ramaphosa's appointment was greeted in currency, stock and bond markets, but his administration is having to work from a low base. South Africa, the most advanced economy on the continent, over the past 9 years under Zuma, experienced subdued growth, ballooning national debt, decreased investor confidence, record unemployment levels averaging 27% and bond downgrades to junk status. Now, growth ticked to 0.9% last year from a paltry 0.3% the previous year. analysts forecast this year's growth will jump to 1.8%. The government will have to raise at least 30 billion rand, that is about $2.6 billion, from taxes to finance, among other things, free university education for students from low-income families, a policy abruptly announced by Zuma on the eve of his departure from the ANC presidency last year.
We need to drive growth in the country. We're chugging along a growth of around 1% in 2017. It's predicted to be no more than 1.8% in 2018. To create job creation, we need to drive growth closer to 5%. We want stability in our economy, I think, is the first and foremost. So we haven't had that stability. We haven't known which way our equity markets are going from one day to the next, up one day, down the next.
The price, they always go up. They don't go down, you understand? So that's the challenge, you understand?
Ramaphosa today needs to make some bold announcements, particularly around the ministerial posts and who should and shouldn't. He needs to make some bold statements about the creation of jobs. It's one thing to promise 1 million jobs, but it's another to actually say how he's going to do that. We had Zuma promised 5 million jobs, if you remember, a few years ago, and those never materialized.
Now, over to Zimbabwe, and a prominent Zimbabwean activist voiced doubt Tuesday that upcoming elections, the first since Robert Mugabe's ouster, will be credible, as the new president's commitment to basic rights was still unclear. Ivan Mwarire, a pastor who became the face of anti-Mugabe demonstrations last year, told AFP that Zimbabwe's legacy of ballot rigging and political repression will take time to shed. Zimbabwe's new president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, a long-standing Mugabe ally, has vowed that elections due by July will be credible and promised to honor the legacy of opposition stalwart Morgan Tsvangirai, who died after a battle with cancer last week. But Mwarire cautioned that while Mnangagwa has been sending the right messages on the economy since the military installed him as Mugabe's replacement last year, the new president's stand on fundamental human rights is still unknown.
It's very difficult for me to believe the new president when he says that the upcoming elections will be free, fair, and credible because of legacy issues. These are people who within their own party know nothing else than rigging elections and violence and intimidation. And it's difficult for me to think that in 2 months they have been able to reschool their entire system. Thinking about leadership and public office in Zimbabwe for me is something that is very much on my agenda. And I think we're now coming up to his first 100 days, and there's a lot of questions about structural changes when it comes to the law, the rule of law, when it comes to democracy and human rights. They've said a lot about business, but very little about the freedoms of people.
Now, the head of United Nations humanitarian efforts in Somalia yesterday underlined the importance of improving communities' resilience to better withstand the effects of recurring droughts, such as famines. Now, the United Nations official was speaking in Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland, where he met with various high-level officials and civil society representatives. A key topic in his encounters was that while famine had been averted in the northeast of the Horn of Africa in 2017, thanks to the efforts of Somalis and their international partners, the risk of famine associated with the drought is still very present, with millions of people in the region still in need of life-saving humanitarian assistance. Now, results of a recent drought impact needs assessment led by Somalia's federal and regional governments with the support of international partners point to food insecurity and rapid urbanization as some of the underlying causes of the humanitarian emergency.
Seeing a lot of displacement, we're seeing the cities and towns in Somaliland growing, and more destitute people who have lost their livestock and lost their livelihoods coming to the cities in expectation of some support and some assistance. And as unfortunately the historical trend is, we will see many of these people not going back. Yes, we're going to have a drought. Yes, things are getting very bad, but we want this cycle to stop. We don't want to have every few years to launch another relief operation with humanitarian effort. We need to make sure that the country does grow its own food, it produces its own wealth so that people no longer have to rely on outside handouts.
Now, the Independent National Electoral Commission of Guinea has published the majority of the results of the elections on 4th February, but the opposition has already called on its supporters to take to the streets to challenge results that have, quote-unquote, nothing to do with those taken out of the ballot box. Take a look.
Sous l'effet de l'intimidation et de la corruption,
under the influence of intimidation and corruption, judges prefer to justify the government's decision by confirming the results that had nothing to do with those which had left the polls.
Le BL, comme beaucoup d'entités qui ont participé.
We are victims of denial of justice. So there are constituencies whose results we do not recognize. If we try to install bolts that are illegally installed, we will react. There, we will ask our activists and supporters to remain calm, but we will prevent a puppet council from being set up at the head of commune we knew we should win. We haven't prevented our candidates to do anything. We were convinced that in our entire Lower Guinea Fiefdom, as it has been since 2010, we would have held our positions. You cannot do fraud everywhere.
Over to Northern Africa, and Libya's Coast Guard rescued 441 migrants in 2 separate operations as their boats drifted off the western coast. 35 women and 16 children were among 324 illegal migrants rescued in one of the operations on Monday with help from a fishing boat. Now, the migrants from countries including Chad, Nigeria, Mali and Libya were drifting in 2 inflatable boats about 7 nautical miles from Zouara, near the Tunisian border, after the engines failed. Now, the Coast Guard also rescued 117 migrants, including 5 women and 2 babies, off the coast of Zawiya, west of the capital Tripoli, on Monday. Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Misrati of the charity International Medical Corps told AFP, now rocked by lawlessness since the NATO-backed 2011 uprising that toppled and killed longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi, Libya has become a key transit country for illegal migration across the Mediterranean Sea.
Some 117 migrants were rescued from a raft spotted by the Coast Guard. We went there and the boat arrived within an hour, with on board 117 migrants, among which 110 men, 5 women, and 2 children younger than 1 year old. They were brought to the medical facility for migrants.
Now, friends and family of legendary Burkinabe filmmaker Idrissa Ouedraogo gathered at a hall in Ouagadougou to remember the life and achievements of one of the icons of African cinema. Ouedraogo died at the age of 64 after an undisclosed illness on Sunday. He had been making films since 1986. His first feature-length release was Yam Dabo, a story about family that made a choice to flee poverty. Then he went on to make about 30 films and win various international awards, including the Grand Prize at Cannes Film Festival in 1990 for his best-known feature, Tilai. Now, the following year, the film won the Golden Stallion of Yenenga, the top prize at FESPACO, a Pan-African film festival started in 1969 to honor the work of the continent's big-screen storytellers. Ouedraogo trained in cinematography in Paris, but returned to Burkina Faso to tell the story of his people. He also worked on theatre production and TV shows. Many young African filmmakers have been inspired by Ouedraogo's work. He was instrumental in growing Burkina Faso's film industry in what came to be known as the film capital of Africa.
I had the chance to work on this film. What I can say is that he was a great man, a great creative and a talented man who had his own quirky ways. But to be an artist, you needed all this to show what you're doing on the field, and it shows today through his work in different projects, which are his greatest legacy.
Je travaillais avec Idrissa. I've been working with Idrissa for 35 years. What really impressed me was his cinematographic talent, the way he had to be able to know exactly where he was putting the camera and doing what he wanted to do. That was the most important thing. He had a cinematic outlook on life that was out of the ordinary. He could turn any place into a cinematic place to do what he wanted to do. Idrissa's legacy is his films, his work and his way of doing things. We have a duty to continue in his footsteps. It's a big responsibility, but as a young filmmaker, I have to tell myself that I will gather enough courage and the inspiration to continue where he left off.
Now, traditionally, secondary schools in Africa have emphasized academic subjects like math and grammar, but there's a new trend emerging. Schools are incorporating curriculum to teach what are known as soft skills to help students succeed in the job market and in life. To see how it works, reporter Chika Odua visited schools in Rwanda and Senegal. She has this report for the Voice of America. Take a look.
These public high school students are on a field trip across the street. They're asking local businesses in Kigali what it takes to get hired. In a few months, they'll be trying to join the workforce.
What I have to do in interview, I have first to introduce myself, name, age, and the second I have to mention my education level and even my background. When you are going at the interview process, you have to dress smart.
Back on campus, the students conduct mock job interviews. Many of them say this is their favorite class. It's all about soft skills needed to transition to work. Teachers equip students to become better communicators, problem solvers, and global citizens. With support from a U.S.-based educational organization, Rwanda incorporated the work readiness curriculum into all secondary schools. The aim is to close the unemployment gap, which stands at 13.2%. A local NGO called Akazi Kanozi, which means work well done in Kinyarwanda, was created to execute the program.
Students must work in groups. For example, a group of 4 students, 5 students, they interact, we give them role plays, we give them scenarios, they present. Those are, through presentations, they are acquiring communication skills.
It's an innovative curriculum that requires teachers to learn soft skills too. Here, Rwandan and Senegalese educators are learning how to be more engaging in the classroom. The Senegalese instructors will take what they've learned to rural communities in Senegal. This junior high school in the Thiès region outside of Dakar is one of the 250 schools selected to participate. The program began early this year. Today, students are discussing values like honesty and sharing.
Local schools certainly have failed somewhere because we had some instructions, we know what geography is, we know what mathematics are, but we did not really have skills to face life and to make our own choices. This is what we miss.
At a nearby high school, students are excited about another new class. It's about financial literacy. The class is an investment for a better future. Chika Odua for VOA News in Thiès, Senegal.
And as promised in last night's broadcast, here now is the interview that our Foreign Affairs editor Lilian Lodera had with the Deputy Executive Coordinator for United Nations Volunteers, Toily Kurbanov. Let's listen into that before we take a break.
The United Nations Volunteers Program is a UN organization that promotes voluntarism in support of peace and development worldwide. With me to help discuss this issue, the importance of voluntarism and the essence of it, is Mr. Toily Kurbanov, the Deputy Executive Coordinator of UN Volunteers. Mr. Kurbanov, thank you for making time for KTN News. First of all, maybe you'd want to start by giving us a brief overview of the essence of voluntarism and what mission brings you to Kenya.
Thank you very much, Lilian. First of all, just call me Toily. Jina langu ni Toily, right? I got it right, I hope. Very pleased to be in Kenya. Maybe I should start with the second part. I'm in Kenya, in Nairobi, because Kenya is important for voluntarism globally and in the United Nations. Kenya is a country that has a strong tradition of the volunteer service. It's embedded in the national culture of the different groups that live in this glorious land. I understand there is a term, Kuji Taleo, that stands for the self-service, for the community service, that speaks how deeply embedded volunteerism is in the Kenyan culture. Kenya is also important because you're a young country. And we expect that all the new solutions come from the young countries. Kenya is not just a young country, but it's a country that, through youthful engagement, had come up with a lot of innovative solutions. From the mobile banking that was unheard of, unspeakable before it started in Kenya, to so many other elements of how technology was used to bring about social accountability, cohesion, and the rest. So Kenya could be the lead in promoting and defining volunteerism as it will be relevant in the 21st century. So that's why Kenya is important. One last thing I should add, Kenya is hosting the largest UN family on the African continent. Here in the United Nations office in Nairobi, we have so many colleagues from so different entities. And it was important for me to meet all of them. And now I'm coming to the first part of your question. Because the main purpose of the United Nations volunteers is to help United Nations agencies, funds, and programs to implement their activities in different countries, especially at the community level, through bringing to bear volunteer passion, volunteer expertise, volunteer dedication.
How does the United Nations Volunteers Program help in achieving the United Nations peace and security agenda?
It's our volunteers, Lillian, it's all our volunteers who are working with UNDP or with the peacekeeping missions or with UNHCR, with UNICEF. Our job is to create opportunities for them through work with UN agencies to empower them so that they can become agents of peace and development. We know that peace and development come together. Where there is no development, sooner or later there would be some challenges for peaceful environment. So it's United Nations volunteers and other volunteers who work in the field, as we say, in the communities, to help communities through the livelihood programs, working with the government, or through improved access to social services. A lot of these agents of change, those UN colleagues whom we meet in the field, they're actually UN volunteers.
Most governments in sub-Saharan Africa are dealing with the heavy burden of unemployment generally, rising over 50% of the youthful populations are underemployed. How can UN volunteers help generate employment and help these countries be able to create wealth?
There aren't that many obvious solutions that are easy to implement overnight. I think a place to start is for everybody to recognize how important it is to attain demographic dividend. On that count, we're very confident that the governments of the African continent, the civil society, the private sector, already recognize this problem. As we say often, the right problem statement is halfway to the problem solution. We should not take it for granted. Many countries in the past had avoided or did not recognize on time, in a timely fashion, the demographic dividend issue. But here we recognize it. It will take whole of society approach. The governments by themselves are going to and are putting out their political manifestos, their development agendas, and trying to rally their resources and different stakeholders inside the countries. And of course, it is understandable that in youthful societies that need to generate jobs in countries such as where we meet, where hundreds of thousands are graduating from the school system every year. It is important that both the educational systems are tuned to the needs of the labor market. And the labor market is flexible enough and open enough, it creates more opportunities for private investment by domestic investors first and foremost. So it will take whole of society approach, partnership between the government and the private sector for sure, and involvement of the civil society.
We have been speaking to Mr. Toily Kurbanov, the Deputy Executive Director of UN Volunteers. Mr. Toily, thank you so much for making time for KTN News.
Thank you, Lillian, for that. And that interview takes us to a very short break, but Bottomline Africa will return shortly. Stay with us.